Welcome to the final panel of the afternoon, The Critical Difference. Our aims here are we ask how can theater critics find inspiration from theatrical practices that emerge from diverse cultures, interpreted broadly? How can they learn to watch culturally specific and intercultural shows with new eyes, welcoming difference beyond cliches about tolerance, tokenism, representation, and universalism? Have the professional practices of the Euro-American theater tradition limited our understandings of what quote unquote good theater is or can be? What is the critical practice of difference? And we're very pleased to have Harvey Young of Northwestern University chairing this panel. So over to you, Harvey.
Excellent. Hello. Here we are. Excellent. So I'm very excited about this panel. I'm happy to be here. So in terms of the structure for this conversation, here's what we're going to do. I will begin by introducing, quite briefly, all the panelists on this session. Each person has a short statement, a position, with which they'll introduce, a framing or outlook related to this conversation on interculturalism and post-marginality. Then we're gonna have a conversation among ourselves for about a half an hour, and then we'll open it up for about like an hour or so of just questions. So you can think about those things that are percolating and hold on to those questions and write them down and then share them with us. So on my left, on your right, we have J. Kelly Nestruck. Kelly is the theater critic for the Globe and Mail, has been there since 2008. He is the two-time winner of the Nathan Cohen Award for Excellence in Critical Writing. He previously worked for the National Post as well as the Guardian. He was raised in Montreal as well as Winnipeg, and he has an MA from Theater, Drama, and Performance Studies from the University of Toronto. Next to Kelly is Glenn Sumi. Sorry about that. I will slow down. Next to Kelly is Glenn Sumi. Glenn is the Associate Entertainment Editor for Now Magazine. And there he assigns, he edits, and also contributes to the magazine in the areas of both theater and film. He is a member of the Toronto Theatre Critics Association, as well as a member of the Toronto Film Critics Association. He's previously worked with CTV News, providing arts coverage as a contributor, and he was there for 3 years. Next to Glenn is Carly Maga. Carly is a theater critic for the Toronto Star. She has reviewed in the city here of Toronto since 2010. She serves on the board of the Canadian Theatre Critics Association. She has her BA in journalism from Ryerson, as well as her master's in theater and performance from York University. And next to Carly is Rick Knowles. I probably suspect Rick does not need an introduction to this group. Rick is one of the co-conveners of this conference, of this symposium. He is a professor emeritus from University of Guelph. He is the author/editor of 18 books, many of them on the topic of interculturalism, including theater and interculturalism. And he works as a dramaturg and as a director here in Toronto, let's say Chicago and Toronto, and he's worked as a dramaturg for the past 30 years. So let's begin with Kelly.
Great, hello. I'm really happy to be here today for the Critical Difference panel with my colleagues here, as well as especially our distinguished moderator, Dr. Harvey Young from Northwestern University, from the great theater city of Chicago, which is a great source of inspiration for critics in Toronto, because we always like to compare and contrast Chicago and Toronto theater. Even though the cities are very different, but they're also kind of similar, Great Lakes cities. I was asked to write a position paper for today, but I don't really have a position, so this is my unposition paper. I think I'm often shifting in my outlook on theater and audiences and how to be a bridge between the two, if that's even what a newspaper critic does. Many of the things I thought when I started this job are different from what I think now. And I have to say, I wrote this before, I wasn't at the keynote last night, but I understand that what I wrote about actually kind of like relates a little bit to the keynote last night. Anyway, so I want to talk about difference to start things off and take this opportunity to reflect on something that I feel differently about, to read part of a review that, probably the review that I regret most that I ever wrote. written the first year. In fact, the first month that I was theater critic at the Globe and Mail in 2008. So I was hired to be the theater critic when I was 26 years old, brought back from London where I was working at The Guardian. And in terms of this word difference or different, it's interesting to me to reflect on myself back then because I thought I was different, which is to say that I thought I was different from the other critics writing for the other dailies at the time because I was under 50 years old. I wasn't originally from England or the United States like the National Post and the Toronto Star's critics at the time. My formative theater experiences were in Montreal and Winnipeg and on the Fringe Festival circuit, not on the West End or Broadway. And having spent a couple years watching theater in London while I was living there and working overseas, after having idealized that theater scene from afar as a younger man, I came back with this idea that that I was really going to fight against the idea that Canadian theater was somehow inferior. I wanted to fight against that and help people appreciate our own theatrical ecosystem. I used to use the word, the expression mental decolonization. And this is a key to where I was perhaps thinking differently because I saw myself as colonized rather than a colonizer. So let's move on to the review I regret. It was an adaptation of Julius Caesar by Yvette Nolan and Kennedy McKinnon for Native Earth Performing Arts. I did not know that this was talked about at the keynote last night when I read this. It was a show called Death of a Chief, and I lumped it in with a Soulpepper production of As You Like It for review in the Saturday paper. I'd seen both shows on Thursday, and my deadline was Friday morning for the Saturday paper. It was 9:30 a.m., my deadline. And what I wrote in a flurry that morning was published under a headline that's still there on the Globe and Mail's website, and it says, Shakespeare done right and wrong. So it was the As You Like It that I liked, and I won't bother summarizing what I wrote about it, but I'm just going to shame myself here by reading what I wrote about the Native Earth production. The Soulpepper production's shortcomings seem inconsequential, however, in comparison to Native Earth Performing Arts' Death of a Chief. An Aboriginal-themed adaptation of Julius Caesar, it trims Shakespeare's play down to a skeletal, unsatisfying hour and a half, and that includes a good 15 minutes of native dancing and singing. Transporting Rome's backstabbing politics to Canadian Reserve sounded promising, but all the talk in the press materials of examining the legacy of colonialization and the impact of ambition and infighting on the Native community must have been mainly for the grant application. The soothsayer that warns Caesar is a two-spirited figure, and the plebes speak in Kuna and Ojibwe, but the play fails to make any resonant connections to Aboriginal issues. Anyway, this is just one little comment. I can't believe that I was basically telling Indigenous artists, I was like, you're not making any connections to Indigenous issues. With the exception of Jenny Lauzon's Mark Anthony and Sherry Maricle's Portia, the performances here rarely rise above drama school emoting. I skip a couple paragraphs. Because of a scheduling conflict, I should note I saw Death of a Chief in its natural habitat, a student matinee. This is so expletive boring, the boy behind me said, not even trying to keep his voice down. If only all audiences had such honest reactions. So this is what I filed in 2008, and I recall thinking early in the morning on little sleep, because I was still adjusting to this strange schedule. I was like, this is me being a really progressive theater critic, because I'm not pulling my punches, just because of whoever is involved in this show. So I thought that thought at the time. Then I went and had a nap. And I remember I had an uneasy sleep. When I woke up, I had a knot in my stomach. I didn't like the tone I'd written the review in. I thought it was unnecessarily dismissive. And when the review appeared in print the next day, I couldn't look at it. I didn't look at the paper. I thought, this is not the critic that I want to be. I got the poster of the As You Like It from Soulpepper, and I framed it so I would remember my mistake, and I hung it above my desk, this drawing of a stag in a ruff. And that was my visual reminder not to repeat that mistake, and it hung over my desk. Anyway, I didn't really learn my lesson there. I thought I'd learned my lesson, but I still thought that what was wrong was that I was dismissive. It was the tone. And then, I kept writing about theater, and I learned more things, and in 2012, I actually took the time to research the history of Indigenous interpretations of Shakespeare ahead of the all Aboriginal King Lear at the NAC. And it was then that I learned that the first professional all-Indigenous production of a Shakespeare play had only taken place in 1997. That was in Sydney, Australia. At the time, I also had started to write more features again, in a way because there was, there wasn't the resources of the paper to just be a critic anymore. That meant that I spoke to more Indigenous theater artists and got to interview them about that King Lear and learned about their complex and complicated relationship with Shakespeare. And in short, over time, I've learned that review was not just dismissive, but it was ignorant. I became aware that I had written off what was a truly notable, groundbreaking production in a few short paragraphs, comparing it negatively to a Shakespeare production by a well-connected, well-established, well-resourced company that has barely stayed with me at all. So, yeah, I regret that review, and I wish I could go back in time and review that again. Review Shakespeare right instead of wrong. And I just thought this was a good place, in terms of my position paper, I just thought this was a good place to do an unpositioned paper and say that in a public place, that I regret that review, to start off this discussion.
Wow, this is unbelievable because I actually regret a review that I wrote early on too, and I'm talking about it here. And we didn't talk about this before. Thank you for inviting me, Rick. Thank you, Harvey. This is what an honor to be invited to talk about this issue. Yeah, my lead is sometimes critics get it wrong. I've seen thousands of shows during my almost 20 years at Now Magazine, and I've reviewed hundreds of them, and there are a handful of articles that I regret writing. One of them is my review of and Sohail is here today too, of the 1998 play Orash, adapted from the Iranian story by Bahram Bezai, by Brian Quirt and director Sohail Parsa for Modern Times. Yesterday, thanks to the internet, there's no link, but I think all of the PDFs of the paper are online. Yesterday I dug up the review, and if you'll indulge me, like Kelly, I will read a couple of particularly cringeworthy passages from it. Now, I was hired in 1997. This was written in 1998. Okay, here goes. Quote, "The play aims to be a symbol-rich parable about nations and heroes, but its arrow, and arrows do figure in the play, its arrow falls short from too much telling and too little showing." Another quote, "There's little sense of what's at stake for the young shepherd, having no emotional connection to the young thing. We feel nothing, for instance, when he meets his dead father on his journey." And at the end, Orash is little more than a reading that's taking itself way too seriously. Needless to say, the play survived my little pan. In fact, it went on to be performed around the world to great acclaim in Tehran in 2002, Mostar in 2009, and then Toronto once again in 2010 before going to Bogota and Sarajevo. If I could have a do-over, I would question my younger self's suspicion of symbol. I would argue that you don't necessarily need to emotionally connect to a character, and that character doesn't need to be in a high-stakes situation. I would also point out that some cultures have a long-standing storytelling tradition, and you don't always have to show and not tell. All of these things became clearer when the show returned to Toronto 12 years later. I was more familiar with Modern Times and Parsa's work, and I was also more open to different performance styles from various cultures. I don't think there's a theater critic alive who would argue that difference isn't important, but unless we travel beyond New York or London and see theater in the places that we travel, how many of us actually get to see what's being done elsewhere? I mean, generally, we rely on what comes here, and that depends on presenters, producers, funding agencies. I remember a time when World Stage really did live up to that name and bring exciting theater from the world, and not just the US, the UK, and the English-speaking colonies. It's impossible to forget things like the Mysteries from South Africa or the Carmen set in the Cape Town township performed in Xhosa. Luminado, before its cutbacks, has filled in the gap with productions like 1001 Nights and A Midsummer Night's Dream. Canadian Stage has made an effort to bring new international works with their biennial Spotlight Festival, which is currently on right now. All of these festivals and companies are forcing us to re-examine what we take for granted. And if international companies don't come here, sometimes local artists can go places and then return home and show us new things. I vividly remember seeing Theodore Smith Gilmore's play about the Chinese short story writer Lu Xun, with a cast made up of Canadian artists that Theodore Smith Gilmore works with regularly, and Chinese artists. Last year at SummerWorks, the Macau Canadian composer Nyo Kong Ki collaborated with colleagues in Macau to present the musical Mr. Shi and His Lover, and it's being remounted at the Tarragon next season. I also cover film and dance, and covering dance especially for several seasons has taught me to appreciate, or at least be more sensitive to, what's also different in theater, perhaps because dance isn't necessarily tied to narrative or story. Canadian artists like Peter Chin, Yvonne Ng, and Denise Fujiwara, who've studied in Indonesia, Singapore, and Japan, have brought theatrical and aesthetic traditions and techniques here for us to see and to expand what we see. And I'd argue even that foreign-born and trained artists like Beatriz Pisano and Derek Kwan, and I don't know if she's still living here, but Dragana Verajic, the Serbian, is she still here? No, she's back in, Serbia? Yeah. Add so much to productions, even when a show isn't set somewhere else. I think their training, their presence, their history affects what we're seeing. When Pisano performed Linda Griffith's Alien Creature last season about the poet Gwendolyn McEwen, it made me rethink this work. It wasn't just a biographical play, but something deeper and more archetypal, and Pisano and Indigenous director Janny Lazon brought out colors in the script that I hadn't imagined the first time around. And even Pisano's accent worked, since McEwen spoke several languages, including Hebrew, Arabic, Greek, and French. And one final observation, sometimes it's not necessarily the play you're seeing that is different, but the audience you're seeing it with. I mean, one of the joys of watching Trey Anthony's work evolve is sitting with her largely Caribbean audience who don't hold back from shouting, moaning, gasping at the characters and situations. This behavior would have been unheard of in WASPy Toronto even a couple of decades ago, but it's part of our culture now, and it reinforces the idea that theater is alive and always changing our perception of what it is and can be, even for naive young theater critics.
So a little context for me. I've been writing for The Star for about 2 years. Officially, Karen Fricker and I were hired as theater critics a year ago this month, or last month. And so I went to journalism school, and I started freelancing after graduating, and kind of on my own volition. In my spare time, I had a day job, and in the evening, decided to kind of take it upon myself and start writing theater reviews. So a lot of it was I had an interest in theater for a long time, and I was knowledgeable of it, but didn't have. It was a hobby that turned into something that that became more serious, obviously. So so the idea of training and development and mentoring of critics is something that I'm really interested in. So when we were asked to speak on this panel, 2 incidents came to mind that I kind of made me decide to come on this panel and speak about it. So and I think this is interesting that we've chosen to talk about our failures in the past, because of Donna Michelle's keynote speech last night used a lot of her own failures in the past as well, and it's always a good place to start from. So my example is a little bit more recent, which is a bit more painful to revisit. I want to talk about in 2015, the Theater Center and Why Not Theater produced a play called, I have to read this aloud. We are proud to present a presentation about the Herero of Namibia, formerly known as Southwest Africa, from the German Südwest Africa.
Really slow down.
Oh,
That is so
sorry.
fast. Thank you.
Okay, so the whole title of the play is "We Are Proud to Present a Presentation about the Herero of Namibia, formerly known as Southwest Africa, from the German Südwest Africa between the years 1884 to 1915." And it's by a Chicago playwright named Jackie Sibley's Drury. And in my paragraph that I want to read, it's about a group of actors creating a show about the genocide of the Herero by German settlers. And in the creation, this group of actors have a director, and in the creation, we are in the rehearsal room as they're trying to create this piece. And it kind of it's about the devolution of this rehearsal process. So I'm writing about the questions that this play brings up. Does the director of the piece, Black Woman, have the authority to tell the story, though she has never experienced genocide personally? And can another white man use his grandfather's traumatic experience in the U.S. Civil War to equalize the trauma of the persecutor with the trauma of the persecuted? What is the toll on the actors who are tasked with reliving past atrocities again and again? And above all, is an extremely Western European theatrical tradition an appropriate vehicle for this kind of story? And what was interesting about the reaction to this show was that the Theater Center had someone in residence write a review of the reviews. And so I was called out particularly for that that paragraph, and particularly the line about is this an extremely Western European theatrical tradition an appropriate vehicle for this kind of story? And it made me thoroughly question what about this was extremely Western, and what about what theatrical tradition am I talking about? And was it because in fact the play itself was reacting against the typical Western play that we are used to seeing. So what was it about the experience of going to this play that I assumed was extremely Western? Was it the fact that that was the type of play that I was used to seeing? Was it the fact that it was in a black box and we were sitting and we had paid money for tickets, and we were watching action unfold on a stage? And so that was a moment where I was publicly challenged to confront that. And I think that that's a really useful thing that has happened more recently, is that we are able to have these kinds of conversations. And and that's one of the reviews that I wish I could go back and redo. And like Donna Michelle said last night, there's no kind of guideline to reviewing this, or to addressing this kind of work. And if anybody says there is, they're liar. So that is something that I feel lucky to be still open, and to be learning, and to be able to address these kinds of issues. So that's my position at the top. Oh no, wait! I have one more incident. Sorry. On the positive side, I remember seeing a show called The Death of a King, also by Modern Times Theatre Company, and remember being very moved by it, and very excited and thrilled by it, but knowing that I didn't really get the full. I didn't know why. I couldn't really articulate why. So I was struggling with beginning this review because I didn't know how to enter it. And then I asked a friend, it's a Persian play, and I asked a friend who was from Iran to explain what the significance of the moon is to them, because it took place on a large circular platform, very much resembled the moon. And as soon as he explained, he said that the moon is a way of reflecting light from the sun in a way that people on Earth can look at it. We can't look directly at the sun, But we can look at the moon as a kind of intermediary. And the king is the intermediary between people and God. So we can't look directly at God, but they can look directly at the king. And that completely opened up the whole play to me. And I could have written, if we had the space, I could have written as much space as they would have given me. And so that was, it made me think about also in terms of Donna Michelle's keynote speech last night, it wasn't his responsibility to tell me that. I could have gone in knowing with that context, and what kind of burden am I putting on other people to explain this symbol to me? For me, it was such a valuable experience, such a learning experience. But also, I've always felt uncomfortable with that I had to get that from someone else. So that's me.
So unlike my colleagues, I've never written anything I regretted. That's not true. But seriously, unlike my colleagues, I'm not a daily reviewer, and I have to say that I have incredible admiration for people that are, who can manage to put themselves on the line with so little time, and do so often with considerable elegance, and I envy that ability. I have written reviews, but they tend to be for magazines and journals and things like that over the years, and they tend to be longer, and I tend to have a lot longer to think about them. So my comments are more coming from outside, looking at reviewers, and they're actually mostly not mine. The first thing, though, I want to do is just tell a tiny little story about teaching, which you'll see the relevance of immediately, I think. That I've found often over teaching career that's longer than I care to think, that I've assigned, difficult reading assignments, or reading assignments that are a little outside of the usual experience, certainly the usual reading experience of the students. And I've often had the response, "This is stupid. I can't understand it." So I just want you to think about that in relationship to reviewing for a while. What I want to do, partly is just to give, this is weird actually, because I'm starting with Death of a Chief. And what I wanted to do is read, say almost nothing of my own, but read to give, in order to bring into the room, a little bit from Yvette Nolan's book, Medicine Shows, and a little bit from a Marjorie Chan blog. Is Marjorie in the room? No? Oh, she had to leave. Oh, good, then she won't know I did this. Thank you. Medicine Shows is the title of Yvette's book, and it's about Indigenous performance culture. And the chapter on criticism is entitled Bad Medicine, as context. And she starts by introducing Death of a Chief, which Kelly's already introduced to us, as being in part about the recent discovery of corrupt chiefs and leaders in the Indigenous community, which Yvette and company explored in the context of dysfunctions in the beginnings of Western civilization. Yvette says, "The reviews seem to me to expose a purposeful obtuseness, if not a downright anger about what? About Indigenous artists' attempt to use the holy grail of English language to tell their own stories?" The Toronto Star had dispatched its senior reviewer. In his review, he reported, quote, "To wonder what it all means. Are Aboriginal political disputes settled today with assassinations and full-scale combats? Does the overcharged, decadent grandeur of ancient Rome have anything to do with the earth-rooted beliefs of the Indian people? Not really." End of quote. The reviewer went on further to tell us what we were I'm removing the names of the reviewers here. I'm just saying the reviewer went on further to tell us what were appropriate plays for Indigenous artists to attempt. Quote, "There are many Shakespearean plays I could see in a native setting, from A Midsummer Night's Dream to Coriolanus, but Julius Caesar isn't one of them." Skipping a bit, as to why Coriolanus should speak to us as Indigenous artists. First she says, "I grappled with this final directive. I understood the relegation of Indigenous artists to A Midsummer Night's Dream. We're often stunt cast into roles as fairies, spirits, or other earth-rooted beings. As to why Coriolanus should speak to us as Indigenous artists, I was baffled. But the reviewer felt completely empowered to dictate what we as Indigenous artists should do with our company, from the pulpit of the country's largest daily newspaper. He told us, and his readers, that we had no business doing this particular Shakespeare. The dialogue we were attempting to enter into with an audience was being mediated by someone who knew better than us about what we should be doing. I was then going to read a paragraph that quoted from Kelly's review that he just read, so I won't do that. So that's one point. And she also goes on to talk about it's not just Indigenous theatre that suffers from this bad medicine. There's a kind of solidarity in the Brown Caucus, the ethnoculturally mandated theatres born of struggling against what mainstream or white stream decrees as theatre. These alliances have led to knowledge sharing, resource sharing, and network building, and the Brown Caucus theatres have often commiserated about how obtuse the reviews and reviewers seem to be. The same concerns are often articulated, that the reviewers are reluctant to enter into a discussion about what is actually on the stage, that they resist other forms of storytelling that are weaving their way into quote-unquote Western theatres, and that the standard is still Shakespeare, or the well-made play, or Aristotelian in form and content. The other one is about context, and it's from Marjorie Chan, and she's addressing reviews of Kawa Ada's The Wanderers that Cahoots Theatre Projects produced. And she says, I have a growing concern with the ease at which reviewers dismiss a culturally diverse piece of theatre, seemingly because it didn't meet their own expectations of what they knew or what they desired to see on stage. The most obvious recent example is this quote from a review of Kawa Ada's The Wanderers. Quote, imagine a show that starts off as a witty immigrant comedy and then suddenly introduces incest, hysteria, and gory self-mutilation. It's a bit like watching Kim's Convenience abruptly morph into Blasted. This is Marjorie now. The plays to which The Wanderers are being compared are Kim's Convenience by Korean-Canadian artist Inserp Choi, a heartfelt comedy about a convenience store-owning Korean family, TV show, and Blasted by UK playwright Sarah Kane, a gut-wrenching piece that comments on the fractured psyches of war. The comparison itself is a bit reductive. Can The Wanderers, the first professional play in Canada by an Afghan-Canadian artist, only be understood or discussed within the context of two other plays, ones which more appropriately fit a Eurocentric model? I can at least begin to understand a comparison of Ada's play to Blasted. They share similarities in theme, tone, and even content. But a comparison with the vastly contrasting Kim's Convenience seems only to be, well, convenient. Kim's Convenience and The Wanderers are completely different. The first is a one-room naturalistic family comedy. The other is an epic, imagistic, and episodic work spanning decades and borders. One is about a working-class family fairly settled in Canada, and the other about broken souls still on the search to healing. Different styles, different modes, different intentions, different time periods, and born of different cultures. And so we come to what the two plays do have in common. They are both plays from a specific cultural community, or brown plays. So why invoke the comparison? It's likely because Kim's Convenience has been the most high-profile brown play in recent memory, the highest profile, and perhaps the easiest to reach. To me, it articulates an expectation on the reviewer's part as a benchmark of what an ethno-specific play should be. But asking a culturally specific story to be told through a specific lens is asking for that culture to be placed in a box of your own understanding. Why do we even have our own specific expectations of the artistic voice of a cultural minority? Expectations of form lead to expectations of content, lead to expectations of voice, lead to the loss of the unique cultural perspective of the artist. Does all culturally diverse work have to live in the same established aesthetic? Cahoots Theatre Company's mandate that produced The Wanderers is one of inclusion and pluralistic values. We believe that all stories are important and deserve to be shared. Artists need to be able to tell the story in the form they want to tell it in. Kawa Ada should be considered on his own terms. His experience is unique, and so is his aesthetic. He writes episodically, mimicking the selected memories of PTSD survivors. He writes elliptically, as befits an indirect style of Afghan storytelling. He writes poetically, because he's an artist. So if not using reductive comparisons, then how do we discuss and engage with culturally diverse plays if they come from an aesthetic that we have no experience of? If there is no prior experience of a particular cultural aesthetic, then what vocabulary and what context should be used? Further than that, if we're not able to discuss or understand plays from different cultural perspectives without being diminishing, how can we even begin to live with and understand one another? That's Marjorie. it's great stuff, isn't it? I think. So for me, the thing that we need to move on to discuss and start thinking about is how can the fact of diversity produce, or how can we use the fact of diversity to produce a new kind of criticism that moves towards a more productive cultural discourse, particularly around questions of cultural, aesthetic, political, and theatrical difference? How can we use cultural difference to transform critical practice?
So rather than having the panelists respond to one another at this moment, I want to offer a couple more questions and have more conversation so that this room is full of ideas for us to tackle in the larger Q&A. And there's a way in which we're thinking about sort of public reviews, public writing. There's often that sense that the review is written for us, right? That the reviewer, the critic, is speaking to us. Is offering their perspective and sort of almost whispering in our ear. But obviously that's not the case because we're all different. We have different perspectives and cultures and opinions. So in a move toward a question, I'm curious to know who, for the panelists here who write for the newspapers, who do you imagine to be your review? Who do you imagine to be your readership? And what is your sense of responsibility to that person?
Start with me. First of all, I write to satisfy myself, my thoughts and my opinions, and I want to make sure that I would read what I write. But in terms of the world at large, it's twofold. I acknowledge that I'm writing for readership who are at least have a general interest in theater in some kind of context, but aren't immersed in it, and as well as I do acknowledge that the artistic community will be reading as well, and so it's straddling both of those worlds.
I mean, I'm writing for people who obviously go to theater, have some interest in it, would read the culture pages, I guess. And I mean, I guess we're fairly privileged at now because because my colleague John Kaplan has covered that scene for so long, for almost 3 decades, and has seen so many artists evolve, so many theater companies change. So I think that there is an informed audience there, and you have a responsibility to them. I'm not necessarily writing for the people who are making the theater, although obviously I imagine they will be reading it, but more for the person who maybe sees a dozen or so shows a year and is wondering whether this is worth their time and money.
That's a really good question, and I think it sort of shifts in a way from show to show, from year to year, of who I'm imagining as my ideal reader. Certainly, theater goers are in there, but sometimes I want to reach just the readers of the newspaper. Hopefully, writing something a review that in itself is something to read, whether or not you can actually go to see the show. Unlike Carly and Glenn, I'm writing for a national newspaper, so that's a strange thing to do as a theater critic because you're often writing for people who will never be able to see a show, especially, So that's often the case, is that I'm writing for people who are interested in theater and want to read about it, and maybe occasionally trying to just pull in someone who stumbles upon it in the art section as well.
And I suspect that's also true for sort of local, regional papers as well, in that the primary readership, will be sort of individuals who want to be culturally informed, right? And sometimes they may be trying to decide if they want to see something or not, or just want to be in conversation with others about a work, right? So what is this thing that people are talking about? Now, how do you approach sort of walking into a theater, knowing the intentions, perhaps imagine the intentions behind the production, understanding that there is a value to the work, to the experiment, to the conversations, to the collaborations that are occurring in the room, but also reconciling that with your own aversion to the piece, right? So how do you, as a critic, sort of negotiate an appreciation for artistic innovation alongside your own sort of gut reaction and gut response to a piece?
Oh, I've got the microphone. Um, that's yeah. I mean, if I sort of take the question to be, how much do you just go in on gut, and how much do you? Uh, to me, yeah.
Yeah,
Maybe you clarify something.
yeah, if I can clarify this simply by saying that we began by framing this as regret, right? Things I wish I could take back, right? And the benefit of regret is that there's some time to process, to reflect, to decide. You know what? Maybe this wasn't the way I should have expressed how I felt, or sometimes it's an understanding or acknowledgement that sort of the larger intervention, the larger sense of experimentation, the larger push in terms of theatrical practice is such that I should have acknowledged that over my own sort of reluctance to appreciate the piece, right? So that's what I'm wondering. So how do you negotiate that like knowing that there's value to a piece, even if you didn't like it at a personal level?
So this is okay. So I see what we're saying. Yeah, it's interesting because I do remember having a lot of ideas in my head at the beginning that I kind of had to unlearn about theater. I think that, oh, for instance, Glenn in that review said that thing. It's like a cliche. Show don't tell. That's something that you hear a lot about theater. Show don't tell. And then at a certain point, you get to see different types of theater, whether it's think of that Austrian playwright. Anyway, but there's all sorts of different theater that's out there, and storytelling is a really a compelling way of engaging with with live performance as well. So I had to unlearn those things and become more open to what is actually in front of me. I think that's what's changed primarily. Sometimes, if it is a different type of performance style, I do like to have do more research into what I'm entering into before I go in. But I think the main thing is just training yourself to be more open to things and appreciate what you see on it there on its own terms, rather than trying to slot it into a particular performance style or an idea of what you want a performance to be. But that's a struggle, I think, every time you go into the theater, is to see what's there instead of what you think is going to happen. And when you're genuinely surprised by something on stage, it can sometimes initially make you feel like something is wrong in what you're seeing. And so I've tried more and more to override that impulse to feel that something is wrong, and to also believe in artists more, to believe that the choices they are making are choices rather than mistakes. I think that's where I've backed into the wrong or a less interesting opinion, is when I've I've thought that an artist is failing when in fact they're setting out to do something that is different from what I'm expecting.
I'm wondering too. Do you read? Do you generally read like director's notes and things when you're writing a review, or yeah? Do you, Kelly?
That's a good question.
I know.
Sometimes the director's notes
Yeah.
can actually alienate me more than.
Yeah.
Sorry, sometimes director's notes can alienate me from a piece, but that's because some directors write in an alienating way, I think.
Well, and you could think, well, I didn't see this at all, so now I feel bad that I didn't see this. But should I have even read this, or should I just write what I feel? I think that if you're doing this for long enough, you realize that yours is not the final statement. It's not the final critique, and it's just yours. And if your readers know your tastes, your likes and dislikes, they'll be able to see through that, regardless. But I mean, there are some shows where I do appreciate the technique, but yeah, on a gut level, it doesn't hit me. But man, what technique, what artistry, and you can point that out, and I think the audience or the reader deserves to, you know, to watch you find your way through this piece. And and I think what seeing a lot of dance also told me is that, you know, sometimes it is a feeling. It is just a gut reaction, and it's not a rational thing that you can really even analyze it and put down in words.
Yeah, I think kind of piggybacking of what Glenn was saying, uh, it does depend on who you imagine you're writing for, because you don't. Well, I always I try to balance going in fresh as someone who doesn't see a lot of theater, who might just be trying out something new, and would to that kind of theater goer, does the larger context of what the show is trying to do, is that as important um, as the experience of watching the show? But I think there is a way. I think there's a the challenge is trying to balance that, making it clear that and recognizing the efforts that are being made to push a certain form or idea or style that is you know is a notable and helpful in a larger context, but also for someone who doesn't have that knowledge, or even that's not why that's not what's bringing them to the theater, to make it useful for them also. So that's something that is constantly, like, it has to be weighed in the way that you write about a show.
I don't have an answer to that because I don't write daily criticism. But can I ask a question?
Sure, go for it.
I'm really interested in whether there are competing demands of being a journalist and being a reviewer. In other words, are there things that sell newspapers that attract audiences to your beat as theater critic that may conflict with how you feel a theater review is addressing the work? Is it making sense? I'm asking this specifically around things like headlines of reviews, which I understand that reviewers often don't assign to their reviews. I don't know whether you did the good and bad one for for the Salt, Pepper, and Death of a Chief, but it seems like journalism is designed to give information about what's happening in the world and to be interesting and attract reviewers to the paper or to whatever. And that may not be the first thing that comes to mind when you want to talk about a particular show. And I'm wondering if those two things conflict, or if they, or how you negotiate those differences, particularly around issues of difference. And you know, I'm thinking of the ways in which news about cultural difference can be topical or not, can be can attract audiences in spectacular ways or not.
I don't really. I've never felt any pressure from editors to change the way that I write about shows in the review. It's not practice that critics get to choose the headlines, and sometimes external factors will dictate how much coverage a production gets. But I've never felt pressured to focus one way or another in the written work.
I don't know if this is what you're talking about, but I guess like publishers or people who are selling the paper like things like stars, because you know people they assume that readers like stars, so they immediately know where a reviewer falls. Either they hated it or they loved it, and they often will try to dissuade you against a sort of middle of the road review. Because it also, and I've written headlines as well. It's much easier to write a headline for a rave or a pan than it is for something that's flawed, and sort of the 3 out of 5 if we're going with stars, which is probably going to be the majority of the shows that you see in any given year.
Yeah, I think theater has sort of evaded the larger problems in journalism in terms of clickbait because just any theater review you write, no matter how jazzy you make it, is not attracting the numbers online that are going to make your media institution any money. Uh, so, I mean, at the Globe and Mail, there's I'm interested in the history of this type of criticism that we do, and as far as I can tell, it sort of is linked to the rise of the the penny press and the rise of advertiser driven newspapers, so that there may have actually been theater ads before there were theater reviews, but people who were placing ads wanted to have some theater content to go next to the ads, and that's why theater critics as a profession exists and is slowly disappearing now as print ads slowly disappear. So, yeah, I guess I don't feel any pressure to write in a particular way to get clicks or that sort of thing for sure.
Okay, one last question, then we'll open it up. So please start thinking about your questions that you have. One of the tension, there's often a tension that can exist between theater companies and practitioners and reviewers, right? Because at best you get a rave review, and often there's mixed reviews, right? And so there can be a tension there. And many times people will say, this is how you should have appreciated my work or the work that I've done, right? Especially if it's a case where there's not the benefit of a retraction, right? Where there's not the public hindsight, there's not an article that, a second review that comes out by another reviewer that says, here's what should have happened. So I was wondering, what can artists and practitioners do, right? To facilitate your appreciation of their work, of their collaborations, of intercultural theater.
That's an interesting question. I mean, just do good work, I think, would be the primary thing. And there's a lot of good work out there. There's a lot of great work out there. I don't know how often necessarily. Obviously we've talked about some of the reviews that we regret here, but I think we've all championed work in that might fall under the category of intercultural as well over the course of our reviewing careers. So I don't think we're blind to it as in a totality. But yeah, in terms of what you could do to foster that appreciation, that's a really good question. I guess one of the things that I find curious is that in the age of the age of the internet, you can't even say the age of the internet now because we've been in the age of the internet so long, the people are reluctant to converse or have a conversation with critics. That's strange to me that there is very little dialogue back at us. I don't often receive messages from theater practitioners saying, you got this wrong, this is what we were trying to do. In fact, I've almost never gotten a message like that. There are very few artists who seem willing to sort of engage in that way. Often we end up with sort of PR people who work for the different companies speaking to us, and I think, yeah, I think that talking to us on social media or over email or in person is not a bad thing. I've learned a lot from my personal communication with people in theater over the years. Like I said, I think I've learned a lot from not being the ivory tower sort of there's a wall between me and the theater artist thing that I think the ideal at the New York Times still is, but almost nowhere else does that exist because you have to go out there and do features and reviews as well, or interviews and columns and what have you. So I've learned so much from those interviews, but rarely people approach me back and say, "Here's Ravi Jain has actually. Ravi Jain's been like, I'd like to sit down and have a conversation with you about this show." And I think I may have. Anyway, I've had good conversations, but it's very, very rare that that's happened.
So Ravi would want to talk to you after you've reviewed a show or before?
Yeah, once he wanted to talk to me after I reviewed a show, and initially I balked a little bit, but then we did end up having conversations.
Very civilized. No, I mean, I feel bad if there's a factual error, and I feel fine about somebody pointing that out. But I agree. I guess it's still a relatively small community, so perhaps artists feel that it's just not beneficial to them, perhaps, to point something out, like in a letter to the editor. Um, but yeah, social media has definitely opened up things. I'm not sure whether they're going to on Facebook or Twitter or something talk about cultural difference or something. Open up that's a larger issue, but yeah, I mean, mostly we deal with publicists, PR people who will pitch a season or whatever, and we'll often, especially if we've been at it for long enough, we'll make up our own minds about what approach to take if we're going to be covering a show before we see it. Yeah, sorry.
I just wanted to add one thing, which is that I think I don't view reviewing as like this is the definitive verdict on a show. I've always wanted to think of a review as the beginning of a conversation, and sometimes you get that online, but more often than not, people aren't engaging in that conversation. But you know, that's what I'd like to see more of.
Yeah, along those that line of thinking, the number of online critics there are now is really and like the different avenues that can be used for theater criticism is really kind of destroyed the image of the critic from on high, kind of displaying their opinion and decreeing from above. That like I think us reflecting on what we've gotten wrong in the past, acknowledging that we're imperfect, and we're also coming to productions with our very specific background and viewpoint, and that is going to be incomplete no matter what. So yeah, I think being here for conversations like this is a good start, and knowing that we are that we're not so well. I guess I can say personally, I am interested in those kinds of conversations, uh, and want to do what I can to like I'm interested. I'm not like I'm not like anti this movement. Like I want to help it in the in the way that I can, and I want to do it the best that I can. But I don't know that until things like conversations like this happen.
I think that's interesting what you said about letters to the editor. I know that I have on a number of occasions, and specifically around, for example, Death of a Chief, I know that at least a dozen letters to the editor went to the Globe and Mail after your review, and none of them were published, including mine. And mine was beautifully crafted. So I think there is an intermediary between what you see and what appears in the paper, and I think that is a kind of editorial intervention that is much more direct than what I was imagining in my earlier question, which was more internal cops than somebody blocking you. But I know we're about to turn out to the audience, and I really hope that we can turn the conversation a bit more to the question I asked earlier about how can the fact of diversity transform the practice of criticism? How can it turn it into a discourse that's more productive than consumer reporting, judgment, into actual dialogue around issues about difference, interculturalism, and theatrical work.
Yana?
Hello there. My name is Mark. I just wanted to ask you guys about where do you see your position as a critic in promoting works that are diverse and going to see shows that are I guess, on the fringes because most canon isn't very diverse, if we're all being honest. So do you see yourself as a sort of at the forefront there, fighting at the avant-garde to make these shows come out and be known, or are you sort of bound by whoever you write for to see shows that are in the can that people will be interested in reading? I was wondering what you guys think about that.
Can we pass that one around? Is there enough to put it on it or no? No? Okay.
There's another wireless around somewhere.
You can take it.
I can say for the past maybe 4 years, 3-4 years, I've made sort of some of these issues around inclusion and diversity sort of at a regular part of my beat, and trying to tackle it from different angles in terms of not ignoring it in reviews, whether a show is inclusive or if it's not inclusive as well. And in addition to that, I've written a number of features and columns, and I'd say just made it something that I come back to on a monthly basis in some way or another. So, but that's more about the larger issues rather than sort of highlighting individual companies. I mean, it's definitely on a day-to-day basis. It's kind of tricky because Toronto, where I'm based, has such a huge amount of theater now. So inevitably there is some choosing that goes on, and a lot of the major companies that produce in the city are definitely there to be reviewed by are prioritized in a way because they have larger audiences or larger subscriber bases, or those are the shows that I kind of have to get to. And then when there is an opportunity to choose, I do try to prioritize sort of diverse work these days. It doesn't always work out. I feel bad. Sometimes I'm traveling too. We don't have necessarily the coverage of a freelancer that we used to. So I'm beating myself up about. Well, not beating myself up about, but I really feel bad I missed Métis Mutt this season. I didn't review that show. I wasn't able to get coverage for it either. But yeah, that's to answer that question.
I think that you have a different mandate as a national paper, and you have a more mainstream, I guess. Even though you yourself, I think the addition of you, you, Carly, has really increased the the range of shows that you review compared to your predecessor. But which will remain nameless. But I think that now my colleague John Kaplan and I have almost always sought out more independent groups that are emerging, and even at the level of editorial, with layout. If there is a non-white person in a cast who's good, we will fight for that in as the image of the show. Because we'll often look at a section and say, well, everyone's white. What can this can't be, this doesn't reflect the city or whatever. So yeah.
Yeah, and it's great. It's great being a mix between Now and the Globe being a Toronto specific paper, but that is daily. So we have and the fact that there are two of us, myself and Karen Fricker. We actually get to in arranging the schedule. We kind of split up. We both will go to the big fancy shows, and then we'll both go to indie shows at VideoFag when it was open, and Storefront, stuff like that. So it's really nice to have someone to share, because there is a lot of theater that happens, as we all know. To have a partner to make sure that we're each getting the kind of full breadth of what's happening in the city. And we also have the space to devote the same space to an indie show that we do to a big musical. So it's not like we have to kind of shove the smaller shows into a corner, or in capsule reviews are really useful, but we have the space to really kind of dig in. So that's been our approach to all kinds of shows, not only those that are diverse, but all kind of aspects of theater in Toronto.
There's also the question of not just of what you cover, but how you talk about. Again, as Donna Michelle said last night, we should try to get rid of the word diversity, but how we try to cover those issues. There's a blog by Giovanni C. a number of years ago now when Modern Times and Cahoots were collaborating on a show called The Sheep and the Whale at the same time as Tarragon Theatre was doing Scorched. And Giovanni blogged about how he was delighted to see the coverage of Sheep and the Whale point out what a great experiment in cross-cultural casting it was. It had people from various cultures, and it was wonderful to see that. And he said he would have preferred to have seen Scorched covered as a bold experiment in cross-cultural casting in which all of the Middle Eastern characters were played by white people.
Difficult to follow up on this, but I'll try. I would like to offer maybe to go back to your question, Rick, about how to respond, maybe, and offer a response. And I think my response will be twofold. My response would be from the position of the theater critic, professional theater critic who was raised in a different country, who was educated in a different country, and came to Canada as a fully formed professional to try to practice, the work here. And then from the position of the teacher and the educator of theater criticism, who has now been in the country for 20 years and sort of assimilated somehow. I think that my response is very simple from both cases, and my experience as a theater critic from a different country really sort of coincided with my pedagogical approach, to criticism now. I think that what we're really facing doesn't matter if it's diversity or anything, is the fact that critics must be educated, must learn as much as they can. And whether it is director's notes, whether it is particular traditions, whether it is a mix of traditions, whether it is coming from dance, opera, whatever background, I think that the critics have the most job, the most work to do in a theater auditorium in terms of studying and understanding what is in front of them. Now, I think that before we were a little bit more lucky, if I would say, because we had less to see. Right, we had less of variety to see. It was easier to learn, right? Now we have so much to see, and not only in Canada, but also from international audiences and international festivals. I think that what we really need to do, and this is what I would propose as a approach, if possible, in the classroom, is to expose students and audiences, through watching, through writing, through reading as much as possible from different cultures. So I think we're very responsible as critics to understand indeed what's in front of us, but also to understand, the roots where it comes from, before we form an opinion. Yeah, that's just a comment, actually. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Kira Loughran, and I'm a theater maker. And first of all, I just want to say thank you guys for coming out and sharing. One of the things that I've been feeling within the day and that I've learned from various diverse interactions, but placing yourself, how important placing yourself and how helpful it is in any dialogue if you're running a dialogue. And as much as, as long as I've known Glenn and as much as I've read Kelly and Carly and hi Rick, I realized through the course of this session that I don't know your position apart from through your writing. So thank you for sharing that with us and being here today and taking our questions and comments and responses, which is I think the category that this falls into. one of your questions, Harvey, around who do you feel responsible to, and the whole question of, why don't artists write back when we get, a review that we disagree with or that seems to have missed our mark as artists. Um, for me, I feel like you are our bridge to our audience, and there is a privilege, I think, from my experience at Stratford. If you were writing for a daily paper, a national paper, a really strong local paper, you have weight. Like, I'm in meetings where it's like, God, we hope we get a good review because our box office is relying on it more than on a blog. I know social media has changed your world, but I also know for the producing houses that I've worked within, that printed review, that larger platform still has a lot of power. And that's a really wonderful thing because it means, you have a reach with your audience. And we talk also as producing houses of like, we're trying to diversify our audience. We're trying to get more people into the theater. And I see you guys as our primary conduit to that because you have that audience that through the virtues of your writing can entice them, can engage them in that kind of way. So in terms of like when I read a review, if it's been critical of something I've done, it sounds like, as you do, I take that to reflect on my own work. I go, is that something I agree with? Is it not? But I wouldn't respond because that's your experience of my work, and my work isn't complete until the audience has come. And so and you are reflective of that, and you are the ones that can help me get other people to come see my show. And I don't know if other people feel that way, but I wanted to offer that as a response. Hearing about the advocacy that you are taking on, but being representatives of these larger platforms to continue to encourage you to advocate for those smaller shows, like in selection of what shows you cover, in how you write about them, what you're talking about, Rick. We really need you to shine the light on those shows that aren't getting covered, maybe to make space. And I know there's a ton of stuff to see, and that within each of your publications that's broad. But in terms of engaging, I think about the talk this morning about the Greeks and the role of theater in society for them. And I always thought about that a lot when I went into theater and going, how can we get our general population, community on a local, national, international level to just go to the theater more and engage in these dialogues with us, because I think as artists that's something that we want. And criticism, theater criticism and reviews are still, I think, the primary way of engaging in that dialogue.
We have a few questions, right? Actually, let's do right back there, and then we'll go over here next. Okay, so no, just the red.
I'll be fast, I hope. It's a question, but in the same vein as the questions that have come and has been touched on, how much do you feel personally, given your actual purview, what you're able to cover, that is your responsibility as record keepers of Canadian or Toronto, since theater history?
I think that's certainly it's maybe not present in like the day to day when you have a deadline and you've just seen a show and you have to get this review out. But in terms of the larger scheme of planning of like reflecting on what the role of the critic is in general, I think that's I think that's definitely important, and something that at the Star we that's partly why we try to see as much as we can, and if we can't make it to review a show, we try to find another way to market. So I have a column where I get to write about 3 things happening that week. We have now a column every Wednesday where we can kind of find another avenue for a production that we think is worthwhile or is worth noting, but we might not have the space as space shrinks. And I think in our experience, editors have been they've been supportive of features, of previews, of interviews. They tend to be more accessible to the reader than a review, because you have to have that vocabulary. You have to have seen the show to really to have a way into it. So finding other avenues, I think, is going to be increasingly important as the journalism industry evolves.
Or devolves. Um, so you were talking about record keeping, like just as documenting, I guess, what the theater scene has been like over the decades. I mean, I also cover film, and it's such an unusual. So seeing a lot of theater and then seeing film, but film you can watch in other ways. You can see, with DVDs, with Blu-rays, you can stream things. It will always exist, and theater is just so ephemeral. I know it's a cliche, but going back, even when I was looking up my shameful review of Orash, I saw a review of one of the George Walker suburban play cycles. I saw an early or a mid-period, I guess, Theater Columbus show, and I'd forgotten about that. I can go back and see reviews that Sochi Fried has been in, who asked this question. And I think, yeah, in some ways we are. And I know that my colleague John Kaplan, I've repeated it a lot, but he will go out and seek things even from performers who've just graduated from theater school. He'll see George Brown shows to spot talent, and often I've heard that this is very encouraging to people who are just starting out to see their name in print or online. And there's a record there, and I if I'm doing a profile, obviously I will go through the archives and am very happy that this history exists where I can follow Kira Loughran's career. I remember a show that you did at at the where was it at U of T at the Glenn Morris Theater, where you had a small role and you stood out. Like, this was, again, probably that's right, yeah. And yeah, so in a way we are documenting in a small way the evolution of theater.
That's it. It's definitely been interesting over the time that I've been reviewing, seeing the long tail that reviews have. And you suddenly see art reviews that you've written pop up and as scholarly references or what have you. There's not a lot of other writing out there, I guess, about shows, or other sources to draw upon necessarily in Canadian theatre context. I don't know how much I think about that in the moment, but I've never really been comfortable with the idea of authoritativeness or trying to be authoritative in a review. I've always would have rather been an idiosyncratic reviewer. But there is that sort of that element to writing for the Globe and Mail, certainly, that something takes on weight over time. Yeah. My favorite reviewer is Hilton Als, who just won the Pulitzer today. He's an idiosyncratic reviewer, I think. Sometimes he's totally off from everyone else, and that's what makes him valuable. I always wish that we were like in Toronto is a weird ecosystem. Like, New York is terrible because the Times holds all that weight, and the critics there are not any better than the critics anywhere else, necessarily. I don't really like Ben Brantley, for instance. I just think he's not a very interesting critic, but he holds so much. I think I was Team Isherwood. I don't know if you know, he got fired recently. But just like years, I think the Times really missed an opportunity too. They just had to hire a new theater critic, and they hired another white guy. I have the excuse of being at the Globe and Mail being the only theater critic, so no matter who the theater critic is, it's going to be one particular person. But I do sometimes wonder when the time to pass the baton is, because of that, the fact that you are that voice for so long. I'm coming up on 10 years. Kamal, who was before me, was there for maybe 4 or 5 years, and then Kate Taylor was there 8 years before that. But now we're in this long, it's like the Stephen Harper decade, but it's the Kelly Nestruck decade of a white guy's thoughts on theater in Toronto.
I do.
Just quickly, a great quote that that it was about art criticism, but I use it as to refer to theater criticism, and I can't remember who said it, which is awful. But it was just basically saying that everything goes out of style. So no matter how much you loved something at the time, eventually that will be passé and it won't be exciting, and you probably wouldn't review it the same that you did at the time. And something that maybe in general the mass opinion is terrible, in time it'll become great. It was before its time. So in issues of documenting what has happened in the record of Toronto theater history, I don't think the quality assessment part is what's going to be important, because that will change, and it'll just be the history, the record of maybe that change in opinion, or the fact that it was there and it existed is what's important.
And sorry, that's an excellent tie-in to Rick's question about judgment. And I do want to put pressure on the comment about just do good work, right? When the criteria or metrics of good have been defined historically according to Euro-American traditions that have marginalized certain intercultural communities that are trying to push past that dominant aesthetic. So how do we assess good work when the companies you're reviewing are trying to push against that aesthetic criteria? I guess that would be my question. But let me pass the mic to Harvey. I'm good.
Oh, we will make it back up there. I promise. I promise. We'll get there.
Sorry. Hi.
We've got half an hour.
I very much appreciate, I'm Mel Haig, I very much appreciate all of the personal equity that you put into your work. I was just wondering, when you do see work, or you see on your docket that there is work that you know is going to be outside of your positionality, so culturally diverse work, intercultural work, could you think of something that, like Carly, you mentioned asking your friend about what the symbol of the moon was specifically. Can you think of something you've maybe received from a company or been able to do in prep that helped you see it in its own space? I think is generally my question. If you could think of something specific that maybe helped you.
I think when I know something is not of my experience, and I know that this is drawing from a culture I don't know. I usually try to I read what is I read the press material. I read interviews that people have done before or elsewhere, to try to get this specific. But it's when it's self-guided, it's really hard to know, because there's how do you research a culture in a couple days before you have, in the time that you have to research before seeing a show. So but I can't remember specifically if there was anything that was sent from a company. I can't think of anything. I don't know if that's. I think there might be a bit of a hesitation to do that, because how much responsibility should be taken from that side to educate us who are then writing about their show. But also I can understand, from my perspective, it's just really hard to know how to begin in those kinds of situations. But I don't know, can you think of anything?
I can't think of anything. Right off the top of my head, I don't know. I think for me, it's more of a process of learning and being exposed to more things individually. So definitely I have a better vocabulary for discussing certain performance art now than I did when I started, because I knew nothing about performance art. But now I've seen enough varying versions of that to have a broader understanding of it. I mean, I also, about 4 years into being a critic at the Globe and Mail, was just like, I'm out of thoughts of things to say. I need something. So something, that sounds strange. But I went and did a master's part-time at the University of Toronto, and that actually, my original idea was like, I'm going to go in and read a lot of restoration comedy, because I know nothing about restoration comedy, and it's a real blank. spot, and but no one actually does restoration comedy, so it's not really. I'm glad I never even took a course on it. But you know, I read a lot of stuff on intermediality and intercultural performance in the course of my studies at U of T that really made me look at theater differently. And then, you know, yeah, so that I'd say that it's been my own research outside. I don't know if I think just out of relationship with the theater company over a number of years has led me to appreciate their work more. That includes Modern Times. You know, like the first show you see of theirs, you might not necessarily know that whatever the going on in the aesthetic is purposeful, but after a few shows, you get to understand and appreciate that style. I think that that's, you know, the case with any artist, is that they sort of teach you how to view their work over time as well. I know that it's probably not exactly what, you know, some people may appreciate something right away, but you think of, you know, again, talk about I wish that there were 100 critics writing in Toronto all the time. You always hear these stories about, you know, Harold Pinter's The Birthday Party, and everyone was like, "This is terrible. This is terrible. This is terrible. This is terrible." And then the Sunday Times critic comes along, and is like, "This is a brilliant new form of drama." And then now we all, you know, I don't know if we all think that, but we have that available opinion, or open that someone opens that window to the work going forward. So. Yeah, reading other critics is good for me too. So I wish there were more critics, and I do read a lot of the blogs as well.
I'm also an editor now, so I can assign some reviews if I'm not necessarily reviewing them myself, but I'll often go see a play afterwards. And I just saw the site-specific show Tough Jews, and I assigned it to a Jewish writer. And I went with a Jewish friend, and afterwards we talked about some things. There was like a sound effect right at the end, which meant nothing to me, and she explained the significance of it, and even some signs, some symbols just going into the space had significance, and she explained those to me. And so I mean, I don't know how I would have researched that, seeing it myself. But I made the decision to give it to Debbie Feingoldbach, and she appreciated it, and she obviously got all of those things. So I felt good to be able to make those decisions, and likewise, I'm not going to give. You know, if somebody hates musicals, I'm not going to assign that to them. Yeah.
I have an example of I think of the kind of thing you're talking about. It again goes back a ways and again is Modern Times, but and Peter, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but my memory is that when Modern Times did its Hamlet, the reviewers talked about some of the sort of exoticism of the show in no specific way, and the Hamlet was influenced in large part by the Tzia-Khani, the ancient Persian epic theater form. No reviewer mentioned that. And then when they did the Scottish play, the program note talked at some detail about the Tzia-Khani, and all the reviewers mentioned that. And some had done some research on what it was. So I think there are times when information provided by a theater company can be used by reviewers usefully and helpfully. All they need to do is mention that form, and then you go Google it. I mean, you find something out about that, and it helps. So, Peter?
Sohei was talking about this the other day, like the use of Modern Times. So maybe Sohei should talk. Sohei's use of diverse cultures in the work. At one point, we felt that it wasn't really being understood why we were doing it or how we were doing it. So for Blood Wedding, we purposefully put it in the program to describe the use of the actors was not about diversity, so to speak, but the totality of their being and how it worked within the production itself. So it wasn't a conscious choice towards diversity. And then you, Kelly, wrote about that, and all of a sudden, Modern Times, that communication of what we wanted to do became public, and then the public came to see the show and see diversity in a new way. So for me, it's that's the exchange which pushes the form forward and pushes the ideas forward. And I think the critics have a huge role in that. And even the director's notes that are sometimes poorly written, but they can say something which changes the game.
Hi, my name's Dominique. I just noticed that there are a few problems that you've brought up. One, that there are just unique theatre critics for each paper. And I'm just wondering, why isn't there more reviews like film reviews, for example, which are shorter? They seem to have at least 3 or 4 people who do film reviews. And because of, I mean, films are lucky because they usually have longer runs. Theatre runs are so short that if you miss that, that's a whole part of history, Toronto theatre history, that gets lost or that doesn't get documented. So that's one of the points. The second point is, seeing as some of these reviews are online, isn't it possible to update some of these reviews? Let's say you do a review and then you go see it again, or someone else comments on certain symbols. Isn't it a possibility then to update that review to add in the additional information? And third solution or third suggestion is also to, when you do have an online review, is to leave an area for the artist to comment if they do want to, so that would be part of the dialogue. If that dialogue is being editorially cut out because they're not printing letters to the editors, isn't it possible then to just add a short, you know, what do you think, or comment from the artist, so that they can also respond directly? That's it.
Yeah, there's a lot there. I can respond to the film question. There are just a lot more film critics, and it seems to be a lot more populist medium. And yeah, the runs. I also think that there's a lot more money involved too. So you have studios buying these enormous ads. There's a lot at stake. And also it's hard to become educated as a theater reviewer. Like you have to be doing it for a few years and to see what can be done. Whereas most oh, and they should yeah, try to freelance for sure. Yeah, yeah. As far as updating, I've often thought about sort of the do-over review, like for regrets. But of what use would that be? I mean, possibly, like especially if you can't see the show again. I mean, it was interesting seeing the Lepage show 887, which premiered at Panamania a couple of years ago. And when I reviewed it this time, it was like what had changed. What had changed in the piece, because I think it premiered there and then it went around the world. As far as artists comment, I'm pretty sure that on all the online forums, people can like comment. Oh, do you have to register or? Oh wow! Oh, I didn't.
No, so there's no comments on the Star, which I feel of two minds about, because would love to hear from the community, would not like to hear from most people on the internet. So, but yeah, no, I think my email is on my author profile on the Star. So people can get in touch. I'm also on Twitter. I don't use it very much anymore. But yeah, I would like to be in those kinds of conversations, but with very specific people and not the majority of the readers. I mean, that sounds bad.
Yeah, we do have comments on the Globe and Mail site. Morris Panich is the only person who ever leaves comments on my reviews. He hasn't in a while, unfortunately. But we had a great back and forth, and I interviewed him about the comments they left on the review. It was maybe like had these. I don't know. You all laughed, so I guess you know about them. And then I do sometimes get into conversations on Facebook and on Twitter as well, personally. And I like to retweet. I like to tweet out other critics' reviews as well. In terms of updating, that's an interesting idea. I like the idea, but it's not really practical from the Globe and Mail site infrastructure point of view. However, I have gone back on occasion and published my regrets more recently. I haven't gone all the way back to 2008, but I did that with Revy's, one of Revy's shows at Soul Pepper. At the end of the year, I was like, you know what? That was a very pertinent show, and I didn't appreciate it at the time. It was the only show that talked about karting in Toronto before it was on the front cover of, Toronto Life, and everyone was talking about it in political circles. No, he actually, in that case, he hadn't had the conversation with me. But then after that, I was like, maybe that's what he wanted to have a conversation with me about. And then we've had the occasional conversation since. And then what was the other thing? I think the number of critics. I mean, yeah, I'd love for. I know I'm not enough. I'm fully aware. There is some freelance money. There's not another person on staff. Well, actually, Brad, I say that I'm the only critic, but Brad Wheeler's been covering a lot of stuff. He's on staff at the Globe and Mail. Lately, he's been doing that. And then we do have a couple of freelancers. Martha's here, our dance critic, who I just pointed her out. And Martin Morrow, we sometimes use in Toronto as well. Increasingly, I'm trying to get my editor is in charge of these things, but I'm trying to use local critics elsewhere instead of me flying into Calgary for a single show, because I found that was unfair in a way to a city to fly in for a single show in a season. It's not the best show that's on in that season. That's the only thing that you hear about Fredericton this year is how bad this one show was. So luckily, Post Media has laid off all of its critics basically across the country, so they're now free for us to use as freelancers. But it is difficult to find freelancers for theater, and it's very rare that people actually email and pitch reviews from elsewhere in the country. And as for me being here, I'm on staff, so I'm a set cost, so I can review as much as possible, and they don't have to pay me any more money because there's no more overtime. But yeah.
So where's the right here?
Hi. Am I still on? Yes. Okay. I feel like so much of this wonderful conversation has been coming back to the same place, and for me, it connects beautifully with Rick's question, which I find a really compelling prompt: how to use the fact of diversity to change critical practice. And it immediately, when you asked it, Rick, made me think about Jeev this morning giving us a little shtick about difference and the rhetorical history of the term. And I suddenly thought about diversity, and then I thought about the word diverse, and then I thought about Shakespeare and the idea of diverse simply meaning many. A bunch of diverse sweetmeats here on the table, and it occurs to me that what we really need to incorporate the fact of the many into critical practice is to curate conversations. We've talked about conversation in lots of different ways. Can we update reviews? Can we make regrets public? Can we have comments? What kind of comments should we have? What about the possibility of instead of being, this reviewer here does this, reads this, sees this, talks about this, retweets this person who said that, can we come together to have conversations like this where you all talk about Death of a Chief for 15 minutes and you put that forward as a review conversation? Some of my favorite review experiences as a reader have been occasions where I have myself aggregated, what did Lynn Gardner and Michael Billington have to say about this same show on this same day? What did all the Times critics have to say about this? What did all the Post critics have to say about this? But I do that because it's my job to know many, many, many people who are in this to know whether or not to go see the show or to learn a bit about diversity aren't going to do that. Why would they? It's not their job. So can we put conversation forward as a kind of reviewing practice? And in addition to that, it means that rather than you going off to find out what the moon means, maybe someone else in the conversation already knows, and you put forth what the symbol means to you, or don't even, because you don't feel comfortable, and then that other thing comes in. And I know I keep going back to Donna Michelle because I love her and she was so inspiring last night. If you are the center of the universe, and we all know that critics are the center of the universe, and we love you, and I understand this as I am also the center of my own universe, then you look outward, right? So why don't we look outward at the conversation and pull it in and find a way to make that a kind of reviewing norm.
I don't like conversation.
You're so good at it,
Like Guillermo. No,
That's an inside joke that you need to explain, Rick. That
Guillermo was talking at lunch about conversation being an overworked word. That we always say when contentious things come up, at least it started a conversation, right? So it's I used. I know. I was being flippant, but conversation. I used to think that community was the C word, but conversation may have taken over. No, I'd rather see. I'd rather see you guys get more column inches, which is part of the issue for me, and time and space to do for a single smart reviewer to position themselves, to do some research, to locate the work in appropriate cultural and historical context. That used to happen when there was only one cultural and historical context, right? when it was always the last production of Hamlet, and then the production of Hamlet before that, and then the production of Hamlet before that. Context is a harder thing now than it used to was, and we've got less column inches to address that, and more articles to write. So, and what ended up happening is what I was reading Marjorie Chan talking about, that what happens is context becomes the latest culturally diverse show, and that's not good enough. And I think what you guys are getting trapped between a rock and a hard place for not having the column inches, not having the time, having more pressure on what you're doing. It's like everybody in the world right now. I mean, we're all overworked and under-resourced. But staging a conversation that brings together 5 writers, not having done any research, taking it. I know, but you know what I mean. That's what happens in conversations. Where does the column inches come from? Where does the time come from? You know, what's the venue? But involving 5 people or however many people doesn't seem to me to solve the basic fundamental problem. And I want to read somebody whose opinion I'm interested in, thoughtful, thick description of a show, well researched and carefully positioned, and it feels to me that the conversation idea of a bunch of people talking about a show just disperses that. I liked it because this. Well, I didn't like it because you notice that. No, I can do that in a bar, and I like to do that in a bar. But there's drinks then.
Hey, so we are down to about 10 minutes, I believe. So here's, am I correct? Yes. So here's what I'm going to do in the last 10 minutes. So let's. On this side, let's spend about like 5 minutes, maybe 6 minutes, just offering a question or thought that takes about the length of a breath, right? And then we'll get a number of them here, and then we'll have final reflections by our panelists. So let's go back, wherever the microphone is. Who has it? And then we'll go back.
I don't know if I can do it in a breath. I was thinking, and then I pulled a switch on me. I'll try. So I'm thinking a lot about the conversations that are happening here on the practitioner side, and that you're all in a very unique position to kind of be, on the other side of the seat. So, a lot of us are like talking on the inside about trying to trouble or challenge the way that we do things in performance. And then you're getting an incredible bulk of the products of those conversations. A question that I have is, as people who have consumed a tremendous amount of performance in many different types and for periods of time, do you feel that's done anything to you and the way that you see kind of your position?
I'm going to throw in a breath question. Thank you, everybody, for coming out and engaging with us. My question is, just in the breadth of this panel and the audience, we have theater critics, theater practitioners of different forms, and also theater criticism from an academic point of view, kind of something also Kelly was mentioning, and also Carly, you mentioned, you know, the Theatre Center commissioning Charles C. Smith to respond to reviewers, and they're continuing that with some other shows as well. And I'm curious again about what your different positions are on the kinds of spaces of criticism, because I know we have a theater critic heavy panel, but again, you're also you wear many hats as well. And so where you would like to see criticism going, whether within the restriction of what your current profession is, as well as just, you know, the breadth of what theater criticism can or you want it to be.
Hi, I think, is this on? I think this is a continuation of that breath, so this will be short. I'm interested in, Glenn, you brought up the stars in terms of valuing system, and it reminded me of Yvette Nolan when Death of a Chief was at NEC, and she thought it was so interesting that they had RCMP caps as their valuing system, which in itself is extraordinarily loaded. And so I'm wondering about the discursive frame that theater criticism is in. It's from 19th century, you're writing in it, no matter how you try to deviate, now it's getting shorter, but it's really within a Western discourse. And I'm just wondering if you could change it, each of you, what would you do?
Let's take two more.
I don't know if you were here earlier today when we were talking about the accents, but my question is, because we were talking about diversity, we were dreaming, apart from it being good work, and let's say that the good work is given, are you maybe dreaming of a theater that would reflect a subway car in Toronto, not only as visible minorities, but also as audible minorities, so people who sound and look like Toronto? Are you dreaming of such theater? Let's say it's good work, and in mainstream, not on the margins, because we're constantly separated, and the mainstream seems to be exempt, and we who are on the margins are so grateful to you to review, and we really are. But long question, but yeah.
In a breath, to Rick's point, what about preview articles that don't focus on a particular production, but maybe take up some of these talking points and cite productions that are happening or coming up that are doing some of this work?
So this morning, the professor from Ryerson says that in the hundreds of acting would-be students who apply to her, it's 10 to 1 or 15 to 1 who are members of a visible minority. So whose fault is that? Is that the schools who aren't advertising? Is it the playwrights who aren't writing the plays? Is it the big theaters who aren't doing it? Is it the critics' fault?
Lots of good stuff. We're not going to address everything right now because fortunately there's a whole other day. But let's open it to panel to offer very brief sort of response to any of the questions that might strike you personally.
If I can try to combine two of the questions, to me, I'm really interested in criticism that taking a critical take on things outside of the individual show routine, the day-to-day, going out and seeing every show. One of the things I'm proudest of that I did was I did an 8-part series where I followed a high school theater production in Etobicoke, sort of from the beginning to the end, and talked about some of these questions. Why do we get the applicants to theater schools that we do? Where does theater lose people when they're 14 years old, even the people who are interested in it? And why does that happen? So to me, that's what I'd like to, I'm interested in taking theater criticism outside of the, opening night, let's write about how the show is. And I think there's a real push and pull there because people are dissatisfied with that form, which is 19th century or what have you, and the star rating and everything. And yet at the same time, there's a real, I never stop feeling the demand from theater practitioners that they want those reviews, and as soon as possible on opening night. So I think within yourselves, there is a love-hate thing with what exists. And it's within me as well. And my answer is to do more long form writing, and I don't know if that's necessarily what is wanted at the same time. So I don't know if there'd be a reaction against like, oh well, maybe we'll just stop reviewing shows on, or doing more weekend reviews of the show that we most appreciated or something like that. I worry that that's where we're going to end up. I don't know. There's all this there's like so many things that I would like to see happen. I just wish that there was more resources for theater coverage, and that criticism could then, I could spend more time trying to do new things with it rather than trying to hit as many shows as possible. I don't know if that was.
Wow, I love the image of the subway car and the divert. Yeah, they can come too. And as far as dreams of theater, I mean, I would also want the subway car to realize that they can go to theater and that theaters, well, yes, logistically, but also that that it is about them. I mean, the number of times where because I mostly keep up with friends by taking them to shows because I'm so busy otherwise. But many times they'll just say, "Oh, I didn't even know this existed," because all they hear about are the Mervis shows or maybe Soul Pepper, but they've never been to the Passe Muraille Backspace or Factory Studio. But yeah, I mean, which one of the reasons why I like the Fringe so much is that you really do get, I think a lot of people only see theater during the Fringe because it's accessible economically. They understand that it's a crapshoot, that there are 150 shows and it might not be good, but it might be fantastic. Let's see, where is criticism going? I hope it's not in these like bite-sized tweets and 140 review or word or character reviews. Preview articles that aren't necessarily about a show. I mean, that's great. We have one coming up next week about why women are such good producers. And it's like the unspoken, unheralded job. But, we're thinking, are women better communicators? Do they just not care about the limelight? I don't know. But it seems that, or are they better at mentoring and passing along information? I'm hoping, just click on that when it comes out, please, to show that there is an interest in this sort of thing. But yeah, I mean, as Kelly was saying earlier, people aren't clicking on reviews. Reviews are notoriously, as the Arthur Capitanis debacle last year with the COC and the National Post showed, an arts editor admitted that performance art reviews are often the lowest clicked articles that they have, and so he happily, would just get rid of an article or not run a review. So if you are interested, just please click on them. Show these people that these things are of interest. What else? I think that's it.
Okay, I'll try to get to these as well. Another kind of interesting debate sometimes I've had in my head is, so in particular, in terms of like roles switching gender, that has been something that I've been trying to debate whether or not how much attention I want to draw to this. Do I want to say like this is an incredible, like what a brave choice, or like what a groundbreaking idea, or do I want to kind of accept that is normal, like that is, it's fine, like it's not, it's just part of the story, and I don't want it, like for the reader, I want to make the insinuation that it's not different, like it's not like a selling point, it's just part of the story. So I don't know if that's answering anything in particular, but it's something that was on my mind. So talking points explored in avenues outside of the review. Is that something that I think is something that we're going to use the Toronto Star column for a little bit more. That's where we've been kind of exploring different. My colleague Karen she has a recurring feature where she goes to the theater with someone who's not at all related to the theater. So she took a cop to see Butcher. She's taking I don't know if this is a spoiler, but she's taking a pilot to see Come From Away in New York. And so those are kinds of avenues that we're trying to experiment with now, and hopefully that's a way that I see criticism expanding in the future. And in terms of the quote or the statistic about people of color going up for auditions, or diverse people who are going up for auditions, I think journalism has a similar quality to it, and I can't speak specifically about theater training, but I know in journalism school it was very much like very white, and so I hope that that criticism is seen as a thing that artists or people who are interested in theater as an avenue that is of interest, and that creating work isn't the only way of interacting with the industry, that criticism is also a perfectly valid avenue. It might be difficult to find a job, but it is still a worthwhile exercise. Okay.
30 seconds. What I'm hearing that I find encouraging, and something that I'm pushing in terms of articulating myself, I'm hearing things about criticism expanding beyond whatever, in various ways, in terms of length, in terms of ways of doing it. I've always thought of theater as a key site for the negotiation of our cultural values, and I'd love to, and that including cross-cultural values. And I would love to see theater criticism expand beyond doing just reviews of individual shows, and to become a forum for the negotiation of our cultural values in the ways it has over history so many times. So I'd like to see it maybe return to that, and maybe through things like the previews that have been mentioned, the long form writing, that kind of stuff would be fantastic. I would die for that, and that includes, I mean, the fact that I'll read. You know, if Kelly does a review of a show in Vancouver, I'll read that. I can't go see that show, but I'll read that, because that's part of that discussion, and that's important to me.
This was great. So please join me in thanking our panel.
It's been really satisfying.